Welcome to the Superhero Bibliophiles podcast. This is the companion show to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast, where we talk about comic books, graphic novels, all that kind of stuff. And today we are going to be talking about Planetary, the third volume, leaving the 20th century. And here to discuss that with me is the same guy who's been here to discuss volumes 1 and 2, and that's Gordon Dymoski. Gordon, how you doing today?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure, and we're going to be having you on again. Well, depending on when this falls in the feed, you may have already been on to talk about Batman Year One, but at the moment we are we're recording at the moment that is still on the schedule. But anyway, um, good to have you on again. Glad to be jumping back into Planetary with you and the gorgeous John Cassaday artwork, which we'll get into. But before we do that, why don't you remind people a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I am a new pulp writer. So I've had works published by Airship 27, Pro Se, and a variety. I've had some essays printed by, I think it's Crazy Eight. I'm kind of all over the place. So I've also been published in several DePaul Pop Culture Conference volumes. I'm also the organizer for Chicago Whovians United. So we do virtual and in-person Doctor Who events in Chicago and beyond. And so, in fact, by the time this drops, I will have just participated in a couple of virtual panels for Console Room, including, if you look on YouTube, one called The Power of Who Community Engagement. So I'm kind of the Doctor Who guy slash writer guy who does a variety of things.
Okay, very cool. And we'll have links to some of that stuff in the show notes as well. But what kind of stuff is grabbing your attention these days?
Ooh, I'm really liking, I think it's the JLA Unlimited series. I'm not sure what the formal name is, but it's the newest one where they just had the whole time travel plot line.
Yeah,
I think it's
Justice
called
League
All Our
Unlimited.
Yesterday Justice League Unlimited. Um, and then I've also been, I think it's the JSA series. They're doing a year one, which I think is really interesting. They're
Right,
doing
Jeff
that
Lemire's
story.
doing that one, right?
Right. Um, and so, yeah, and so pretty much comics wise, that's what's been really kind of getting my attention. I've been doing a lot more catching up on older readings, so just just some Marvel stuff. Your basic Spider-Man, Hulk, that kind of thing. So,
Any particular runs or creators that you're looking at with the Spider-Man and Hulk stuff, or are you just kind of like hopping around and seeing what grabs your
I'm kind
attention?
of hopping around because I feel like I've been with the MCU, I feel like I'm burning out on that. But I also don't want to just dismiss what's happening in the comics arena. It's like it'd be easy to say, yeah, it's like, okay, one version of Marvel is not my favorite, but this version, but the original comics, I want to just kind of enjoy those for what they are and kind of get back to, finding the joy in that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, for my part, I did read that I'm the Justice League Unlimited. I just read that time travel story, the one that crossed over with World's Finest. That's the most recent trade, I believe. So that's where I'm at right now with that. Um, I haven't checked out the JSA stuff, but that's on my list. I've heard good things about that JSA series. Jeff Lemire, his work on Green Arrow and Old Man Logan several years back was phenomenal. So I definitely curious to check both of those out, or to check out the JSA stuff because of just based on the strength of him being the writer alone. But for my part, I've been kind of jumping around a little bit myself. I reread the first issue of Astro City fairly recently. I also am almost finished with the Magneto Not a Hero series, which came out of, or not a hero. It's Magneto Was Right. It was the name of it, and it came out of
Right.
fairly recently. I think it was De Mateus, if I'm not mistaken. And it's one of
Mhm.
those. Marvel's been doing a lot of these like flashback minis where they've been doing these stories that, and a lot of times they try and bring back the old creators. So they did a Wolverine series called Wolverine Patch with Larry Hama. There have been a few Venom ones by David Michelini. or Michelini. I'm never sure exactly how to pronounce his name. There was a Daredevil, the Black Armor version, done by I think DG Chichester, I think is his name. I can't remember
Mhm.
exactly, but yeah, they've been doing these little, flashback minis, so it's been kind of cool. That one, I've been reading the Magneto one, and that's pretty good. It's going back to the time when he was headmaster of the New Mutants. I think the X-Men were presumed dead at that point. Um, so it's an interesting read.
Yeah, and it's I think the one book that I'm really starting to be taken by is the Immortal X-Men, which is a really interesting. I like the premise, especially since there's a retcon about how if I remember it correctly, it's like Moira McTaggart has like a mutant power where if you kill her, she resets the timeline or something like that, and it's that I find is kind of interesting. And I've kind of
Yeah,
been Yeah, and I've kind of been mad the X-Men for the longest time. So it's like, oh, okay. It's kind of I'm starting to perk up. It's like, oh, okay. Like Marvel's starting to do some interesting things. The same way DC is. I think they
well,
realize that. Go ahead.
just don't get too attached to that Krakoa stuff because it's over now.
Okay, no worries. But
But
it's
yeah,
like
sorry, go ahead, finish.
I was about to say, it's nice to see that Marvel and DC have realized that, they don't need to appeal to the same kind of demographic of fans. And it's really, I think creatively they're starting to do some interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the Krakoa stuff, it was interesting. I thought the concept was more interesting than the execution. I felt like some of the characters didn't quite feel like themselves in some cases. Although Immortal X-Men was one of those exceptions. Like Kieran Gillen, he also did a run on Uncanny X-Men several years back, right before Avengers versus X-Men. That was really solid. So if you like what you're reading there in Immortal X-Men, I suggest checking out his Uncanny X-Men stuff too. He did some stuff with the Celestials in that too. He had a really fun take on Sinister in that as well. So that was a cool series if you're interested in going back to that.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
But today we are going to be talking about, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Planetary Book Three, Leaving the 20th Century. So we talked a little bit before about your history with Planetary, and refresh my memory. Were you reading this in real time as it was coming out, or did you wait for the trade on this?
I was actually reading it. I started like with issue 7, backtracked the first 6, and then was reading it in real time. So, and then when the trades came out, I immediately just, I I bought copies, so those are like part of my regular reading rotation.
So, what are some things that jumped out at you with this volume? Right at this point, we are nearing the end game with the series because this is the penultimate volume. Elijah Snow has gotten his memory back, or most of it. That he says that there are some pieces that are still kind of missing, and so this has a lot of. It's a very flashback heavy volume because it's flashing back to things in Elijah's past that we haven't seen before, stuff that him and the Planetary crew were doing before his memory was erased, as they're also trying to put things in motion for their inevitable confrontation with the Four. But what were some things that jumped out at you going through this?
Well, in reading this book, I think one of the things that really struck me was how um, solid this particular section is. I mean, um, it kind of reminded me of there's a in old school Doctor Who fandom. If you're dealing with a 4 episode story, there's a rule of thumb that says the third episode is always bad because it's always a runaround. It's just trying to catch up to the plot. There's none of that here. I mean, this fits very solidly as a third volume. I also like how the book is willing to go not just into obvious, but into slightly more obscure kind of elements of popular cult of kind of the hit of his pop culture history. Like you've got the Universal Monster episode, in episode 13, the kind of Marvel-esque of 14. It the thing that surprised me was the Australian Indigenous the Dreamtime issue in 15. because that's not something that a lot of Western that you don't really see a lot of. And it was usually it's handled with a bit more um it's usually used more as a plot device, but I liked how it kind of used that. I I like how it flips the kind of it starts there's one issue that starts with kind of a crouching tiger, hidden dragon, and then kind of flips into kind of a weird kind of Fu Manchu-esque with a little bit of John Carter at the end because there's a character that comes back. Um, and I love the kind of Edgar Rice Burroughs riff in the next last one. And I think the last issue is really great because even though it's essentially a plot against the four, I like that it's really about this moon mission that nobody knew about from the 1850s. And I think there's such a wonderful sense of this is one of the few comics from the early 2000s that I think manages to still have a sense of wonder, even though it's not obvious that it's throughout all this. Like there are moments where Elijah Snow visits Ambrose Bierce, not Ambrose Bierce, Ambrose Chase's widow and child. I
I
mean,
was making that same mistake too.
yeah, it's um, yeah, because as we all know, Ambrose Bierce was a character in Planetary. He and Elijah co-wrote an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, but no, it's that nice feeling of like history is starting to come together, and I think that this is a solid kind of it establishes, yeah, this is what the past is, but the story keeps moving along, and I think it's none of these feel obligatory. None of these stories feel like filler. And again, John Cassady's art, like that to me is the high point because some of the things he does stylistically is just wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Cassaday's art, it continue is again, I've read this series, I think at least twice before this latest reread. And also, his work on Astonishing X-Men, his work on Captain America, and every time I read something that he drew, it never ceases to blow me away as if it's the first time all over again.
Hmm. Yeah, it's there's such a freshness, and I think because he pays so much attention to detail, it never feels. I mean, he's essentially, going off of Warren Ellis's script, he's essentially drawing something that's supposed to be timeless, um, and yet, um, you know, feels contemporary. I mean, the one thing that I found jarring, and it's a writing decision, and it's more of a personal glitch. And it has nothing to do with his art, but like in the first issue where Sherlock Holmes is telling Elijah Snow about, yeah, we had this conspiracy, and he brings up the word eugenics. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, it's 1920. Sherlock Holmes, it makes a certain amount of sense coming from that time period, but it was kind of like, ew, you know, at that point. But like other than that, this is a really good rock solid 6 issue run.
The first issue really stuck out to me as well, especially because it feels like this is, a lot of this is Ellis doing kind of his own riff on different things in pulp or in comics. So way back in volume one, we saw like the gathering of all the pulp pastiches, which very kind of like bring into mind the whole idea of Philip Jose Farmer and like linking them all
Mhm.
together. Right, we've obviously seen the analogs to Marvel and DC with the four, being the most obvious, but we also had the stuff like the Green Lantern stuff or the Wonder Woman stuff in the previous volume. Um and this one kind of feels like a riff on Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, because here we've gotten these classic characters from literature, not pastiches like we've seen up until this point, but we have the
Mhm.
actual characters. So we have Sherlock Holmes, we have Dracula, we have the remains of Frankenstein's lab, and all of them getting together, and Snow going to Sherlock Holmes so that he can learn from Holmes, which also is kind of a,
Mm.
subtle riff on Batman too, because I think that was one of the things too that is happened in Batman stories. Eventually, he went back in time and he studied under Sherlock Holmes or something along those lines at one point.
Yeah, there's it was the I think it was on one of the anniversary stories. I think it was Detective Comics number 576, if I'm not mistaken, where it's like Batman is solving a mystery and he ends up running into Sherlock Holmes, who's like, "Oh yes, I'm retired, I'm a beekeeper, the pipe is for show." And so I know that there's that kind of reference there. There's that reference. So it's like Batman was influenced by Sherlock Holmes, but then eventually meets him. But I also like how it's, it's the, um, and it's funny you said Alan Moore in this issue, because not only did I think that, I thought that the issue following it with the Thor's hammer, that was the Grant Morrison issue, where it felt like that kind of, okay, this is the kind of, well, okay, this is the wacky, crazy idea that can only work in comic books, but it's also about, okay, the way that Morrison writes action scenes, because it's very abrupt, and then we go from uh we don't know what happens to Snow, but then we see him on the surgical table with Dowling telling him, "Hey, I'm going to put some blocks in your mind," and with Snow finally telling his team, um, uh, don't come after me, but take these bastards down, which I thought that seems like a very Morrison style
The
of
Morrison influence was something I was going to bring up as well. Like, not only in the 0 Point issue, which just that whole explanation of
Mhm,
where the how like Thor's hammer switches places with Don Blake's cane, but and then we get they have this whole other world that they've basically killed so they can use it as a weapon storage facility. Um,
mhm,
but then also the Dreamtime issue, which you mentioned too, that feels like a very Morrison concept, right? That whole thing feels very Morrison. In fact, of the volumes we've read so far, I think this is the one where Ellis's voice feels the least pronounced. Whereas, and we've talked about this before, how in the previous two volumes, the Ellis snark, it can sometimes go over the top and can be a little bit too much. There is not much of that in this volume. I feel like in this volume is really where Ellis kind of melds with the creators he's homaging here.
mhm. Yeah, and this feels, and I wonder if part of it might have been that after you're writing a series like this for a while, you kind of realize that, okay, some of the stuff I have to take seriously, and you have to honor it. And I think with Ellis, because this is kind of the we're approaching the end game. I wonder if he felt like more confident that, okay, well, I don't have to worry about being snarky. I just have to tell the story. Because if you look at Opakari, the next to last issue, I mean, that is tremendously moving. Even though there's things, even though there's some interesting transitions, like, okay, he's being told by this futuristic city in Africa, don't mate with our women. But then in the captions, he's talking about, oh, okay, I should have realized it when this woman had her tongue rubbing my molars and planting me against a tree. And it's like that kind of, yeah, that's an Ellis, that might be part of his trademark, but it's also a very moving story about a guy who heads to a city and, they contrast him with Lord Blackstone, who is kind of like, it's like, this Tarzan knockoff is kind of like, yeah, I just come out here to, excuse the phrase, but go native. And this is probably the most Wold Newton-esque of the issues because I caught a very slight reference to A Feast Unknown where, they're taught, Snow and Blackstock is his name, are talking about women, and Blackstock says, "Oh, I've had sexual relations, but not with," and just left it there but not with girls, basically. And so it's kind of like, and A Feast Unknown, without going into details, it deals with some of the more sexual undercurrents of a Tarzan-like character.
Yeah, that line jumped out at me as well. So I wasn't aware that it was that was a reference to Philip Jose Farmer. Before we get too much into Blackstock, though, I do want to go back to the idea about Ellis kind of taking a step back and downplaying his own, Ellisisms.
Hmm.
And another moving aspect is and again, the Dreamtime issue in chapter 15, where they go to Ambrose's home and they talk to his wife and his daughter. And and the way that Snow and Jaquita are handled here, they're very warm and compassionate, which is feels it doesn't feel normal for based on what we've seen of them here, but it works. And I feel like that is also Ellis taking a step back, right? Because there's no there's no real snark here in this exchange, right? It's just very much we're here to help you out.
Hmm.
And in his line to and even when he's talking to, Angela, the daughter, and he says, "Your daddy was a hero. Your daddy saved people's lives, lots of them, including mine, and he didn't need a red cape to do it. He just had to be him." In a typical Ellis story, I could feel him taking a shot at Superman in that, like trying to say, like, and he didn't have a red cape. He didn't have like a Ponzi red cape or something like that, is kind of what I think would be Ellis's natural instinct to do a lot of the times. But he doesn't here. He holds back on that and he just makes it very matter of fact. I thought that was really nice and showed that Ellis was doing some maturing as a creator over the course of this series.
Yeah, and I also think he's trying to give these characters a semblance of humanity because in all the episodes, in all the issues leading up to this, it's like they're in the middle of action. We know Chiquita doesn't tolerate boredom and she's active, and Snow is. And since the arc, spoilers, folks, is going to lead to the rescue of Ambrose Chase, I think Ellis needed to have this read as if these are two people who miss a colleague who respected the colleague. And I think this sequence sells it because it would have been easy, as you said, for Ellis to do the Ponzi red cape or for, Chiquita to be like restless. I mean, there's in that, I mean, actually in that scene, in that same issue, Drummer is, you know, Snow is saying, "Oh, okay, we're going to inject like a virus into the dream time." And he and Drummer are having a back and forth, and Drummer says, "Oh, you've actually been listening to me?" And Snow says something to the effect of, "Well, I'm not going to admit that out in public," which I love. It's like that, even that was kind of a like, we know he has some of Ellis's snark, but at least there it's a little bit more, it's less about Snow kind of disrespecting Drummer and more like, okay, yeah, I hear you. So I think we're starting to see, and I think it helps Ellis differentiate, um, Snow's team from the four. Is that Snow's team actually respects each other? Snow's team, um, there's a semblance of humanity to them, whereas with the four, at least what we see up to now, they are just horrible individuals.
Yeah, I think that was maybe something Ellis maybe had realized as he got to this part of the series that okay, these people don't really seem like they respect each other at all because there's a like the kind of back and forth snark like always insulting each other in the first two books. And like we talked about there, I mean, I thought the least interesting thing about those first two books was actually the planetary characters themselves, right?
Hmm.
Snow, Drummer, and Jaquita. But what was most interesting of it was all the pastiches and the homages and the kind of like meta journey through popular fiction. Whereas in this one, the characters start to feel a little bit more like they're taking center stage. We're not only here for the pastiches anymore. Now we're actually starting to get invested in the characters.
Hmm. Yeah, I think before the storytelling was you had to kind of figure it out because I think the first volume was all world building. Then the second volume was okay, kind of setting up, okay, here are the dynamics. And I think now it's kind of, and I'm sure that some edit, whoever was editing the book at the time kind of said, hey, Warren, why should we care about these characters? Like, what makes them different than the four? Like, what makes them really, why should we be following them? And I think in this arc, he's giving us the reasons why. We learn about a lot about Elijah's past, that he was just going around the world and doing stuff. We learn a little about Chiquita's past, and there's a nice little, very super subtle nod to Superman at the end of Opakri, where she's given to a couple that had an interesting encounter with basically a spacecraft. Um, It'll be in the next volume that we learn about Drummer. But I think it's also like, I think this is also given, even though it's being more character driven and more subtle, I think this collection contains one of the greatest comic panels that has ever been drawn. And that is a frozen Dracula getting kicked in the nuts by Elijah Snow and just seeing it fall apart. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something you just have to. So I think it was kind of like, I think once Ellis wrote that, he's like, okay, yeah, I need to soften it. There's no way I can improve on that.
Hmm. Yeah, and oh, and also the fact that Holmes just, he reacts just very matter of factly. He's like, I've wanted to do something like that for a long time. He's like, oh, but just so you know, that's not going to kill him. He's like, yeah, I figured most of the stories were true. I also figured he's not going to regrow his lap in a hurry. So,
Hmm.
so we'll see. I can't remember. Does Dracula appear again in the fourth volume, or was this kind of the only time he pops up here?
I think this is the only time he pops up.
And I wondered if Snow did actually have time to, completely kill him off, or if he pops up again at some point. But anyway, also there's some interesting, super like, comic book sciency things they use to explain certain things. Like we talked about with the Thor's hammer type thing, where I mean, it's not technically Thor, we don't know what it is, but it's a hammer that looks just like very similar to Mjolnir, at least the Marvel version of it, um, where it swaps places with this cane, and the way it does it is through this like transportation system where um, they have the weapons in storage in this other world, and this is great. And talking about great artwork, right? Snow gets transported into this other world, and he's walking on just like the ground is just lit. It's all white except for the ground, which is littered with bones, and you have all these weapons just like floating there in air. And he says they killed an entire world, so they had somewhere to store their weapons. It's just a very haunting statement right there. But then also when we get uh the oh God, trying to remember her name. But the Invisible Woman analog, right? When she
Oh,
pops
Kim
up here.
Suskind?
Yes, thank you. Yes. When she pops up here and she's wearing these like sci-fi looking goggles, and then we find out that those actually have a purpose, right? And because technically when you're invisible, right, the way vision works is light is reflected through your eyes. So but if you're invisible, the light just passes right through it. So how can she actually see? And it's like, oh, these goggles provide the answer for that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of a subtle nod. There's a novel that was made into a really bad film called Memoirs of an Invisible Man. And it talks about how it's a guy he's an industrial spy. He gets caught in like this weird explosion and he turns invisible. And he's talking about how when he's invisible, he has to cover himself up when he eats, because he's going to throw it up, um, because he can actually see himself digesting. But the other thing is he talks about um, when he sleeps, he has to put something over his eyes because when he closes his eyelids, he can still see. So I think there's that kind of real. Ellis just took it in a slightly different direction, but I think yeah, there's that acknowledgement that yeah, comic book science isn't always it's comic book science, but it's also like a realistic sense of comic book science.
Yeah, it's a lampshade effect in a way,
Hmm.
right? We're kind of lampshading the concept of invisibility and how these things are used. We're gonna take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about Planetary.
We all love superhero movies and TV shows, but what about the comics that inspired them? Marvel, DC, Image, and more have provided the template for the movies and shows we all enjoy watching, and it's important to honor that tradition by buying and reading comic books. Superhero Cinephiles is proud to be an affiliate of mycomicshop.com. It began as a small mail-order business operated by junior high school student Buddy Saunders all the way back in 1960, and has been operating on the internet since 1997. My Comic Shop has new releases, value packs, back issues, trade paperbacks, comic art, regular auctions, and a whole lot more, including 35% discounts on pre-orders. You can also sell your own comics or utilize their consignment services. You can even create your own want list of comics you're searching for. To get started, check out our affiliate link in the show notes or on the superherocinephiles.com homepage.
And we are back. Another thing that was interesting too, and well, one thing about the science thing, like Ellis has done this. There's one other thing. I don't know if you ever read Global Frequency. It was a series he did in the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah, I have read a few issues of that back in the day.
I've heard there's one thing that stood out to me, and it's still something that, I remember all these years later, especially whenever we get into like cybernetics or anything like that. There's a woman who has like a cybernetic arm in it, and one of the things that she made a point of talking about was how they had to like strengthen the muscles around it and the bones so that it could actually support the weight of a metal arm. And I remember thinking at the time, like, oh my God, that's right. I'd never thought about that, but that is something you would have to consider with cybernetic implants. Like the body is not built for that kind of thing. And you think about something like, Wolverine with his metal skeleton, the guy probably weighs like a literal ton.
Well, I think they actually had to change in the comics actually to change his origin from being a pure adamantium skeleton to his skeleton laced with adamantium, because what they realize is that bones have marrow, marrow creates blood cells, and if you have a purely metal skeleton, you're going to die. So I think that was kind of they kind of tweaked it so it's like, okay, it's laced with adamantium.
Yeah, or like coated or whatever the case may be. Yeah. But another thing Cassaday does in this issue is that he turns it into a flashback, but in a subtle way, right? Because I didn't realize it when I was first reading it that it was a flashback. But then when we get through it, and then all of a sudden Ambrose pops up, I'm like, wait, when did Ambrose come back? But then we see here in one of the panels, and I didn't realize this right away, but it clicked a little bit later. Drummer is clean shaven,
Hmm.
right? That's just like a subtle way of, whereas most of the time he's got like kind of like this, goatee 5 o'clock shadow thing going on, but he's clean shaven in this one panel, and just in that one panel, Cassaday is telling us that this is a flashback.
Yeah, and it's yeah, and I think it's one of the nice things about this particular segment is that it is, to use a Doctor Who term, rather timey-wimey, but I think it helps to forward the story because it's not, I think at some point, um, whether it was an editor, I think he realized that we needed to understand these characters and why are they doing what they're doing. And
Hmm.
why, again, we've talked about why are they different from the four? The four is all about we've got all this great technology, we're going to hoard it. We're going to keep it to ourselves, and Elijah is just and Planetary is just like, no, people should have this, in the flashback with Ambrose's widow, Elijah says, hey, there's no reason why you should have to work. As of, however many minutes ago, you're now independently wealthy. And I think it's where Ellis is kind of showing that, yeah, these are Planetary is about humanity at its best. And
Hmm.
if, snark aside, I think he's looking at this as we have all these great gifts, let's share them. And there's a sense of, again, I go back to that sense of wonder. Whereas I think with, um, yeah, and the four are obviously kind of the, super selfish, et cetera, et cetera. And then why they are will be in volume four. But I think by doing these flashbacks, we understand these what is motivating Elijah Snow. Well, we actually know through that issue. With Chiquita, we learn about her background and you know, um, why she's not just, excuse the term, action babe. Like we understand where she's coming from. It'll be the next volume. I think we get Drummer's secret origin.
Hmm.
Um, and I think this is kind of it's giving us a little bit more of a context because it's like, okay, Um, it can't just be plot, 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 plot. But I think Ellis does a really, and Cassaday do a real good job of revealing aspects of the plot while also revealing aspects of character.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good, it's a nice way to kind of transition into the overall end game of the series.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Also, I like what we have this exchange right before they put the blocks on, and we kind of figure out, well, why does the four, or again, what is this central conflict? And it's this whole idea of, and it reminds me of Superman 2, right? That scene after Zod has taken over the world and he's sitting in the White House and he's just very bored. And Ursa's like, "You're master of all you survey." And he's like, "As I was yesterday and the day before that." And he's just completely bored out of his mind with the idea of having won. And there's we get a little bit of that from Dowling here, right? He says, um, "This is a game, right? We're just playing a game here." He's like, "But you're getting too good at it though, and we can't lose to you guys, right? We still have to be in charge. So we're just gonna change the game a little bit." So it's kind of like inputting a cheat code in here to kind of like
Mhm.
change the stakes of things. But it's still that idea of like he wants that game to continue. He wants this idea of Planetary posing some kind of challenge. Not too much of a challenge, but just enough to alleviate the boredom. I thought that was really cool.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that it also shows, Dowling's arrogance, where, he's like, um, this is a guy who's like, hey, now he's just a game, but like he's the master at playing it, where he's like, yeah, I'm going to do this to you. I'm not going to do it enough. It's like your traditional Bond supervillain speech, except
Hmm.
it's because if you think about it, if you're going to put mental blocks on someone, you're not going to make them a real challenge. But Dowling likes the game. You're just, I'm going to give you enough so that you're not going to be able to stop us and you're going to forget. And I think the fact that, um, and I think the fact that throughout this, we can see that, okay, when Elijah's determined, Elijah Snow will get what he wants, get what he
Hmm.
needs. And I think this is all really setting up for, um, kind of the conclusion where it's basically we figure out, okay, what's the Four's ultimate goal? And, when Snow takes them down, it's really with just, it's not even, it's not even with all this fanfare that Dowling does. It's just like, hey, you're going down. That's it.
Hmm. And then also in this the Dreamtime issue too. This is also another, Morrison-esque thing. The idea of using an Aboriginal song as a key to unlocking Dreamtime. Again, really cool idea that he comes up with, and it makes me think that he was, because I believe him and Morrison were friends at least at some point. So I imagine he was probably maybe he was getting some input from Morrison on this kind of stuff here because Morrison was very clued into that kind of stuff a lot of the
Yeah,
times.
and I know Morrison used Um, I know he used the idea of music unlocking reality a lot when he was writing Final Crisis, which came, I think, wasn't that in the 2010s?
I believe so, yeah, because I think Infinite Crisis was 2006, if I'm remembering
Hmm.
correctly, or maybe earlier than that. Maybe no, maybe that was like 2000 something around there. But like, yeah, Final Crisis was at least pre 2010, I believe, because I think 2010 was around the time because 2011 was the New 52, and so I think yeah, probably Final Crisis came around some point between 2006 and 2010.
Hmm. Yeah, so I could see where Ellis and Morrison are talking. Morrison talks about Dreamtime, the Dreamtime Aboriginal songs, because I think that's actually part of their um, part of their mythology. And Ellis goes, okay, I'm going to go one way and see it as kind of a put it in technological terms, for
Hmm.
lack of a better phrase. Whereas Morrison kind of does the Morrison thing. Um, because I do know I mean, he's pulled from that from Final Crisis and a little bit in Multiversity.
Hmm.
So I think that it may have been like a casual remark where, okay, you know, Ellis said, okay, I'll use this idea, but Morrison said, yeah, this is my idea, but he thought of different ways to use it. If that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah. And it may have been in the Invisibles as well. Like the Invisibles was chock full of like different uh type of magical things from different cultures. So there may have been some of it in the Invisibles as well, but it's been a long time since I read that all the way through, so I can't recall specifically now.
Hmm.
Now, this character, Carlton Marvel or Marvel or whatever, um, I was trying to think like who this is a pastiche of, and my mind first went to Marvel from the Marvel's first Captain Marvel, but that doesn't seem to fit too much. And then I was thinking John Carter, but now I'm thinking like Adam Strange, right? That kind of fits the best.
Yeah, I'd say Flash Gordon, Adam Strange, that kind of person who, Earthman who goes to another planet. It's not really a sword and planet or a planetary romance, but it's not quite hard science fiction,
Hmm.
because that's who, because I think, they're talking about rocket travel in the 1930s, but the science wasn't there. So I figured, yeah, I think Carlton Marvel is kind of the Flash Gordon, um, that kind of character, Adam Strange kind of character.
Now you'd also touched on this issue earlier, the chapter 16. So this is where we see Anna Hark. And yeah, this kind of surprised me too, because there is very much you summed up exactly what I was thinking too, like this very like kind of like Fu Manchu meets Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, it reminded me of, I think it's in the first volume. There's like it's kind of like I think it's the ghost in Hong Kong, if I'm
Yeah,
remembering the plot
I
correctly.
was thinking about that as well.
But I think it's interesting because Ellis kind of, luckily he avoids the kind of ick of the Fu Manchu novels by because this could have, um, this he could have easily written Anna Hark as the Dragon Lady stereotype. And I think he does. And I like the fact that in this, in that second half, where at first we see her kind of being, ruthless for lack of a better term, willing to take on, but not only does Elijah Snow confront her about what happened, it's the character from the first one where they find the thing in the building and he's converted into, kind of that weird kind of bio armor.
Hmm.
Um, Snow says, "Yeah, we know you did it. It's not an accident." He comes back and they talk to each other. And the last page, I love the shot because it's Elijah Snow in foreground and it's silhouettes of the two in back, and it's quite clear that they're more than just employer employee. And I think I loved how, in that Alice manages to not only avoid like the obvious stereotype, but also really give her a sense of humanity where
Hmm.
she essentially says, "You're right. I'm on the wrong side. I'm going to switch over. You know, I'm going to align myself with you." And I think it's to Cassidy's credit that he's able to do. I don't know if even though he's got a very distinctive style, he doesn't draw the same issue twice. Like
Hmm.
here, this is a lot more. It feels very water to me. It feels very, and it may be the colorist, but very painterly. It feels the way that shots are composed are not like like your typical. It doesn't feel like very. Um, it doesn't feel very kind of fetishistic about Eastern themes. If it
Hmm.
doesn't feel like it's. I'm not quite sure how to articulate it. It doesn't feel like I don't feel like I'm reading a pastiche of Sax Rohmer,
Right.
which it feels a lot more humanizing. And I mean, I think it's maybe one of the maybe the most underachieving of the issues, mostly because it's very easy to just gloss over the fact that it's when you see an artist and a writer do something right, it's easy to kind of ignore.
Hmm.
And this could have been an issue that could have been oh so wrong.
Yeah. But well, along that lines too, like the talk about the shot composition, where we first get introduced to Anna here in the office, and just like the use of the Dutch angle here is really
Hmm.
is a really interesting way to show her there. This kind of idea that the world is askew right now. And And in part of that's because she's been on the wrong side. But also and I'm thinking, I think that he had to have been using photos or something for the cityscape in the background, but it works in such a seamless way. It blends very well with his style that it doesn't feel out of place at all.
Hmm. Yeah, and it really is. Um, I mean, this is. Yeah, I'm not sure what I could add to that. I mean, Cassidy has a really good sense of how to compose. I mean, it's very filmic in a way.
Hmm.
It's very filmic, but he also manages to do it within you know, a comic context. So it never feels like it's overstepping its bounds. I mean, it just feels every shot, every panel feels spot on, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And speaking of that, that is a nice way to segue into 17, because one of the most beautiful pages in here is when this serpent, guardian serpent or whatever, attacks Elijah and bursts the way Cassaday draws it bursting out of the water with just the effect of like the water, the drops flying through the air and everything. It has an amazing sense of motion. I don't know if you're much of a video game guy, but there's a video game Final Fantasy VII, and there's a character in it called the Midgar Zolom, where in this one part you have to cross this marsh because there's this giant snake monster underneath the swamp there, and it pursues based on footsteps. So if you go in there, it's going to detect your footsteps and it's gonna jump right out. And you need something fat, and so you need to get. It's basically a trigger in the game where you have to go through this quest. You have to find the chocobo, this creature that can run really fast across the marsh, and it can avoid the Zolom. But if you try going in by yourself and you fight this thing, it's this massive thing that And when it opens the cutscene, you see this giant snake right in front of you. It's very reminded me very much of this thing here in this panel.
Yeah, I mean, and man, that's just so visceral. And then, after Snow shoots it, as it lands, you see like these round kind of portals open, and the snake grows feet, and it starts, and even Snow's like, "You got to be kidding me."
Mhm.
I think there is that kind of sense of imagination, and that's when Lord Blackstock comes in, and he's all like, "Oh yeah, you can." I almost could hear him in that kind of very stereotypical, "Pip pip cheerio, dude. Let's have some tea
I
and
know.
crumpets."
Yes, exactly. Now this Opak Ray, like my first thought is Wakanda. But is there anything else in like the pulp traditions or the Tarzan traditions that you think is a better fit for this kind of
Well, I
society they're here?
think I'm not as much of a Burroughs scholar as others. Um, I do know that like after the first couple of Tarzan of the Apes um, novels, I think Burroughs said, let's go into the fantasy thing because we kind of know what Africa is like by the early 20th century. I think part of it is kind of a riff on the Lost World narrative. So things like Arthur Conan Doyle, H. Rider Haggard. Um, I think there are, um, and there's also like tons of like old literature about like Thomas More's Utopia or that talk about like the ideal state. And I think the idea of, Lost World is usually about, okay, we're going to go to deepest, we're going to go to another continent and oh wow, there are these indigenous people here. We never saw that. This is a whole new world. But he flips it on um, so it does have that Wakanda vibe, but I think it's also the idea that, okay, um, the thing that brings Snow to them is that in one of the captions, it's like there were some like advanced technology that was found like just floating downriver. So I think there's the idea that okay, somehow technology escaped. Um, and because this is very much and this is a society it's very interesting the way Ellis sets it up. It's like, okay, if you're an outsider, the law is not as harsh against you. You're put up in terms of five people who kind of figure out what you did wrong and have different perspectives. And he's invited to stay because he has specialized knowledge of the outside world. And I think it's that idea that, okay, this is a society that's kind of enclosed itself, that wants knowledge, but is so focused on knowledge that it's like it doesn't allow for any other external influences to come.
Yeah, and also there's the I think the eugenic stuff that Holmes mentioned here, that kind of comes into play here with Opak Ray, right? That whole idea of like, oh, we want it to and it's this old nationalist narrative, right? This bullshit idea of like, there's we can't have crossbreeding, right? So
Yeah,
um oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it's one of the characters says we don't want any white in our water.
Right, yeah, yeah. Um but there's also this idea, it's but you know what? There's interest in you though, right? So you have to be
Hmm.
careful of that.
Yeah, and I
And
thought, yeah, go ahead.
no, you go ahead. I was going to move on from something else.
Well, I was about to say, I think it's, I think what's interesting is that it's, I mean, this is where, Elijah meets his first great love. Um, and I like the fact that, this society is looking at, they refer to Blackstock as King Ape. He
Hmm.
thinks he's King Ape. He wants to. So I think they kind of see through his kind of like, I think getting from this, I don't think Ellis cares for the character of Tarzan at all.
No,
Um,
no, which is understandable. I mean, honestly,
mhm.
I don't know how much of the Tarzan stuff you've read, but I went and I reread the original book several years back, and my God, is it fucking racist? Even
Yeah,
for that time, it is really fucking racist.
I read it too, and it's like, woo, boy, like no, no, yeah, but it's nice that what Ellis manages to do is, yeah, this is the secret origin of Chiquita Wagner. But I think what he also does is I think it's a nice kind of inversion of the idea that, all these great pulp heroes were, somehow inherently noble. And Lord Blackstock is a douchebag. Let's just, he's like, yeah, my parents own land and I'm here to go native. And, hey, I like to enjoy you know, um, why should I enjoy women in this secret city when I can have British girls? And like,
Hmm.
yeah, but I think again, it gives us a nice contrast to Snow, who's like, at one point he tells his lover, hey, look, if you don't want me to come back, just say the word. And,
Yeah.
that's, so yeah, um, I think this is probably of all the issues, this is probably my favorite because I think Ellis does so much to really, I mean, this feels like a really solid script. And I mean, Cassaday's art, yeah, I'm not going to complain. It's really good.
Yeah. Speaking of that, and that it leads to the final issue here, and that's the gun club. And you had touched on this before earlier, the idea of this like primitive spacecraft they invent as a way to travel into space with the only technology they have at the time, which is basically you take a metal it's the hyperloop thing, right? That's basically what the
Hmm.
idea is here. It's like you have this you propel it with enough speed, enough force to break atmosphere, and then it gets caught in the Earth's gravitational pull, and it's just like the G forces just kill the people on board, and it just stays up there for decades until it finally
Hmm.
falls down again.
Yeah, and it's nice because there's a nice little nod to Jules Verne because that's how he had. I'd have to look at the dates to see when he had written his book, but he actually wrote a book. I think it's called From the Earth to the Moon,
Yeah,
where
and
he
which is the
described.
inscription on the photo.
Hmm. And so, but I think what I like is that it starts, this issue starts as, oh, okay, we know about this space thing that's going to fall to Earth. We need to get there before the four does. Um, William Leather, the guy who burned the Superman analog in Volume 2, comes and he lands and you know, he's we see how impulsive he is because he goes to a thing where they've rigged a bomb and uh drummer says special message for Mr. Buttwipe, and then it explodes. But then it turns into this really, I think, charming, this really nice sense of discovered history where Snow didn't know about, like nobody knew about it. And it's like they're figuring out what this is along with the reader. And that's what I really loved, that it's not just this great thing that, oh, we knew about years ago, but just never got told. It's like there's a real sense of discovery. And that's,
Hmm.
I think, I know we've talked about how Planetary was supposed to be kind of like the secret origin of the Wildstorm universe. But I love the fact that now he's kind of weaving in this doesn't feel like a world-shattering event. It feels more like, okay, here's this interesting thing that happened that nobody knew about. I think a more modern equivalent would be like the Tulsa massacre in 1921 with Black
Hmm.
Wall Street, that we didn't really hear about it until the Watchmen TV show in 2019.
Right.
Um, and so I think it has that feel of here's some history in this universe that we didn't know, and now we do, and isn't it cool?
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, that it's a really it's the cool thing about it too is it's not like this massive discovery, right? Especially in the realm of like a sci-fi universe thing where there's all this other stuff going on, but it's interesting nonetheless. And it's just surprising enough. It's like, wait, how come I didn't know about this thing? And it is a pretty cool little way that he plays with it there.
Hmm.
Um but yeah, and the secret history of the wild, I've talked about this in our other episodes, but that is like probably if you're gonna have if you're a continuity nut, like that is probably the biggest failing of this series, which it does not feel like it's set in the Wildstorm universe at all.
And I think it actually helps it because that way you don't have um, although you'd had those initial ties, it becomes a world of its own.
Yeah, I mean, I think I every time I look at this, even though it's purportedly part of the Wildstorm universe and it was published by Wildstorm, or at least the Wildstorm imprint when they eventually got bought out by DC. Like I every time I read of this, I always think of it as its own universe because it's so incongruous from the rest of what Wildstorm was doing at that time that it just feels so separate from the rest of it.
Hmm. Yeah. But I think
Uh,
it, go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead, finish.
But to say it really feels like a world of its own. And, I wasn't reading any other Wildstorm books at this point. So to me, I think it works as a nice reader friendly, done in one. I'm glad that like DC has never decided, oh, let's just throw, we own Wildstorm. Let's just throw Planetary in there, that
Well,
they weren't part of the new.
they in a way they did because they did that the most recent Outsiders series that had I think Ambrose Chase was in that and it
Oh,
had
okay.
kind of a planetary feel to it. I think Chiquita Wagner may have been part of it too or the drum but it was the Kate Kane Batwoman was also part of it too.
Okay. Yeah, I
So,
haven't read it. So
I haven't read it yet. I've heard it's good, but I haven't checked it out yet.
yeah, I'll have to check it out.
But it's definitely invoke like even if you just look up the covers of it, you'll see it's very much invoking Planetary with the covers.
Hmm.
But that's a story for another time. And I think that's is there anything else you wanted to mention about leaving the 20th century?
No, I think it's probably it's nice to see the pieces coming together. And I think as you read all these, these separate volumes, there's a very natural flow to it. Nothing feels out of place or like, oh, here's your obvious fill-in issue.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it all worked. Like when you said that the Blackstock issue may have been your favorite, that got me thinking like I don't have a favorite in this trade because I think it all works together as like
Mhm.
one part. So it'd be like kind of picking your favorite. This really feels like a book. Like it really each there the issues here are called chapters. Each one really feels like a chapter, right? These little vignettes that all contribute to a larger whole. So I thought they did a really good job with that aspect of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think um, it's got me eager to read volume 4.
Yeah, well, we'll have to have you back on for volume 4. And there's also the Crossing Worlds one, which has them crossing over with the Authority, Batman, and Justice League. So that's something else
Mhm.
to keep in our back pocket. But for now, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Okay, well, you can find me if you're interested in Chicago Hoovians United, you can go chicago-hoovians.united, chicago-hoovians-united.org. My homepage is gordon-dimowski.com. You can find me on Amazon. I'm also on Patreon.
So people can check out that stuff in the show notes for the links. As for us, superherocinephiles.com is the website. We are superherocinephiles.com on Blue Sky, Super Cinema Pod on Instagram and Threads. And that does it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.